Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when and where you are, and welcome to another Festival in a Box 3.0 tasting session. This is the Hein Rare VSOP cognac session, so a slight change of pace from the whiskey tastings that we've been doing. I'm delighted to say we're once again joined by Nathan Shearer from Specialty Brands, very good friend of the Whiskey Lounge, who's going to talk to us about Hein Rare and cognac in general. Good morning, sir, or good afternoon, as it now is. I've tipped over.
Hello. How are we doing?
Doing very well. Doing very well. How about yourself?
A little bit under the weather with this sort of cold that's going around. It's not coronavirus, thank God. I've done all of the tests for that. But if I sound a little sniffly or snuffly, then you'll know why.
Well, that's all right. Hopefully, a little tot of cognac might help cure that slightly.
Cognacs and lemsips. That's what I'm going for today.
Now, listen. I know that we've introduced you before in another video, but that's not to say that they might not watch this video before that video. So, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself a little bit and what it is you do with Specialty Brands and Hein, that would be great.
Absolutely. So yeah, my name's Nathan. I predominantly work on the whiskies for Specialty Brands. So Nikka, Kavalan, Michter's, Amrut, Waterford, Drumshambo, Lot 40, Pipe Creek, Elements of Islay. There's probably one that I've forgotten. But occasionally at these sort of whiskey lounge festivals and shows, we'll bring some other spirits. So whether it be cognacs, whether it be rums. So I kind of put on a French accent or a French hat and discuss a little bit about cognacs. So yeah, my role is essentially just education across the whiskey portfolio and occasionally jumping into some slightly other but very, very premium and delicious spirits as well to just chat around.
Brilliant. And we're going to be tasting this Hein Rare, which I've got up here. This very fancy decanter looking bottle. Now, as I'm pouring it and we're nosing, do you want to tell us a bit about the Rare VSOP, and then we'll talk more generally about Hein itself and cognac indeed, because obviously people will be more aware of whiskey perhaps with this box, but would like to know a bit more about cognac.
Absolutely. I mean, the first thing to note is that it is an aged brown spirit, so we're not too far away from what whiskey is. But the Hein Rare VSOP is a VSOP, and so we're talking about something that's called a very special or very superior old pale, and it's kind of the second step up in the aging process of cognac. So you start with a VS, which is normally around that sort of 2-year mark. And then a VSOP, that goes from anything from 4 years. Rare VSOP is actually 7 years old. And it's a mix of about 25 different eau de vies that go into it. Just like whiskey, you distill and you put different kind of eau de vies into barrels. And then it's a blend of these eau de vies as they age. So 7 years old, 40% ABV. And this was actually created by Bertrand Hein. So created in the 1960s. And this has been the 6th generation of cognac makers at the Hein domain. It's still family owned today as well, but we'll discuss a bit more about Hein as we're going through. So for me, on the nose, it's very, very untypical of a cognac. I always think that a lot of the cognacs, especially the ones that people might have tried from buying in supermarkets or just sort of dipping your toe in the water, they tend to be really, really woody. So loads of vanilla, lots of oak, and you lose a little bit of what cognac should be, which is fresh and fruity. It's literally made from grapes. So if you go too far away from it being, fruity, then you've just kind of killed the whole reason for it. So for me, Hein is very much that kind of fruity, floral, not too much oak, but very, very precise and very perfumed. So for me on the nose, it's kind of stone fruits, nectarines, apricots, there's a little bit of melon, and then really nice kind of notes of jasmine, violet, a little bit of lilac, these really kind of nice, fresh, opulent fruits in there. Fantastic, and if we always talk about, cognacs and whiskeys, if you've had 10, 15 whiskeys at a whiskey show, something like this, just as a little reset of the palate, just as a little kind of like, oh, something a bit different, it's always really nice. And when we took this to Manchester, end of October with you guys, it shone because everyone was just so surprised that you could have this amazing style of cognac and it paired really nicely with the whiskies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, like you say, it's nice to try something outside the comfort zone, but as you say, it's not entirely dissimilar to whiskey, and certainly you might there might be some sherry cask whiskies which might remind one of a cognac.
Yeah, definitely. And, when we're talking about sherry casks and European oak, I mean, we are using European oak specifically for cognac. It's a French oak, but you will start getting some of those more slightly not tannic, but slightly more kind of wood-driven flavors, not just the vanilla and the coconut and the kind of cinnamon that you'd expect from American oak. You get a bit more of that fruity richness, a bit more kind of toasted spiciness coming from the European oaks as well.
It's really very more. It's quite biscuity and slightly. There's a little bit of marzipan as well. It's really, but not too much. It's like you say. There's a
nicely balance between that kind of like fruitiness from the grapes, and then going into that kind of nice European oak kind of marzipan, almond, those sorts of flavors coming in. And that's always what Hine's about. It's about finding the balance between the fruit and the oak without ever letting the oak take over. Because even some of the cognacs that Hine make, there could be 50, 60-year-old eau de vies in there, but you still have this really nice fruitiness and really nice freshness with everything.
Now, whilst we're enjoying that, Nathan, could you perhaps fill us in on the world of cognac? And I know it's very difficult in the short amount of time we have together, but just in a nutshell, how cognac is produced, and perhaps its major differences from particularly single malt whiskey, production process, and perhaps the casks as well, how they differ from casks that might be used in Scotland or elsewhere to make whiskey, and then perhaps how Hine sits within that sphere of cognac, because obviously there are the very famous big brands, Martell and Courvoisier and so on, which a lot of people know. How is Hine different from those larger brands, perhaps?
Yes, I mean, cognac in general, it's probably not quite as old as whiskey. We can kind of look to whiskey as being the 1300s. But cognac, we start to see cognac not as cognac, but as a brandy around the end of the 16th century. So we're in the southwestern part of France here, about an hour and a half north of Bordeaux. And the cognac region is a very similar region in terms of soil type to what we've got over in Champagne, so the other side of France, and also to what we've got in English sparkling wine. So because that soil was so similar, they just planted grapes there, and they made a variety of very local wines that weren't particularly aromatic, but they were quite acidic. So using grapes like Ugni Blanc and Folle Blanche. Now, when the Dutch VOC started, they would use the Charente River, where Jarnac is, or where it's situated, and they'd use that as a resupply. So they'd come from Holland, or they'd come down through other parts of Europe, and they'd resupply their ships, normally with wines and beers and anything local, for the longer journeys over into the New World. Now, the Dutch realized that these wines, because they were quite acidic, they didn't last very long, and they didn't always taste that great. So they started single distilling them, and this became known as brandy wine or burnt wine. So this was kind of the start of cognac. So this was 16th century single distillation of these wines, and then going into the 1700s, the French started to kind of premiumize the spirit a little bit. So they started using double distillation with what we know now as these Charente pot stills. It's a bit different to a whiskey pot still. If you Google Charente, you'll see it's got this really sort of big, fancy looking dome on the top of the stills, and that's part of the heat exchanger. But the French started laying these spirits down, these eau de vies down, in the same types of barrels that we would have used for wine. So you're talking about sort of 450 to 550 litre barrels of European oak. Now, as these eau de vies aged, they started to gain a bit more elegance, a bit more finesse. And so they started to actually become known as, brandies from cognac. And then in the 17th and 18th century, this is where we see massive kind of British, not immigration into the area, but British got involved with it. And they started then selecting these eau de vies and then started actually becoming the merchants for them. So this is where we see the likes of, Hennessy and Remy Martin and the likes of Hine starting to set up. So in terms of production process, I mean, if we think about whiskey as just distilled beer, at its most basic, we literally ferment some grains and then we distill those grains into whiskey or Ishkabeda, put it into barrels, and that's kind of what we're doing with whiskey. With brandies, we're just doing the same thing, but we're using fruits. So Hine have about 120 hectares, which is about 120 football fields of vines. And they also buy some grapes from other people as well. And then they make a wine. out of these grapes, and then from there double distillation and then aged, for X amount of years in this European oak. So, when we're talking about the wines that we use to make cognac, they're certainly not wines that you'd want to drink. And that sounds a bit counterintuitive, but it's kind of the same as when we're talking about single malt whiskey. You wouldn't necessarily want to drink the distiller's beer in most single malts. I mean, it goes right through you if you do. So these cognac wines are essentially very, very acidic. They're very, very kind of sharp, and they've got not a huge amount of aroma, but that means that they're really good for distillation because we can concentrate all of those flavors that we want. Acids are really, really good for sort of carrying across these kind of rich characteristics when we do the distillation. So then once it's been distilled, and there's a few weird and wonderful rules with cognac distillation. You can, once you've harvested, so around September, October, you have to distill everything before the 31st of March. So that means that there's no distillation in the cognac region between sort of the 1st of April up until the end of September. So 6 months of the year, you're just not allowed to distill because you need to keep the wine fresh. So there's literally people with locks that will go and lock all the stills and things like that. So these eau de vies get put into barrel, predominantly French oak. So normally from forests like Tronçais and Limousin. So these very famous forests you might have heard of for wine production. And then one of the key things that's a little bit different with the barrels from, cognac versus whiskey, for the most part, all the barrels are toasted. So rather than them being charred, which caramelizes that top layer and gives us a little bit more of that kind of bitterness and a bit more of that access to the sugar, these cognac barrels, they're bigger and they're also very, very lightly toasted. Hein is exceptionally lightly toasted. What we want with that toasting process is to just open up the pores in the wood a little bit. It allows the brandy to penetrate deeper into the wood and get access to more of the sugars. So, we kind of see deeper interactions between the staves, and we also see a lot more of the agalic acid, which is the tannin, breaking down into woody flavors like lignin, vanillin, and lactone, which gives us that kind of really nice sweetness with the cask as well. Now, some of the cognac distillers, they'll tend to really heavily toast the casks, and that'll give us more and more vanilla. With Hein, it's a very, very kind of typical light toast, which means that we get a lot of florality in there too. So in terms of production of cognac, it's a product of one harvest. When we talk about whiskey, it tends to be, you can have barley that's been sat dormant for 3-4 years. So it's much more of an agricultural process, I would say, compared to what we see in most whiskeys these days. Now, that for me just means that we've got slightly more variance between the distillations, which means that we just have to be a bit more focused on blending, essentially. But yeah, that's kind of cognac in a nutshell. You take wine, you distill it, you put it into barrels, and then you've got a pretty similar process to blending as you do with whiskey, just with the added kind of hindrance of a vintage in there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, it's fascinating, and I'm thoroughly enjoying that. I must admit, it's a lot of cognacs I've tried in the past tend to be, smell quite lovely, but then when you taste them, they can be quite drying, and I suspect that's due to maybe over aging in more aggressive oak, as you say, with a heavier toast or even a char or whatever. Whereas this seems to be much more supple and easygoing.
I agree, and I think at 7 years, you've obviously got a huge amount of color coming through on it. But when we think about a 7-year-old whiskey, we think of that as being really, really young. Whereas in cognac, because it's brand new barrels and they've been toasted, and then because you've got a slightly warmer climate as well down in Bordeaux, it's slightly less humid, but it is a lot hotter. So we just end up with a slightly, I'm not saying tropical aging, but a slightly more kind of continentally aged spirit.
Yeah.
But because we've got the grape flavor in there, grapes are nice and sweet, they're supple, they should give us all of this really nice fruity characteristic. Whereas working with malts and single malts, we've got much more of a bitterness up front, much more of that kind of malty, biscuity flavor. So you're kind of coming at it from two different sides. We're almost looking to increase the chewiness in the cognac and reduce it a little bit in the whiskey. So it's just coming at it from two different angles, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's fascinating, really fascinating. Definitely recommend a visit to the cognac region as well. It's really beautiful, and some tremendous distilleries to visit. Can you visit Hein?
Yeah, so the distillery at Hein is called Saint-Denis, and so that's what we've used for 3 generations as the contract distiller. So those guys, the 3 master distillers there, they basically sleep at the distillery from September to March because they run the stills 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
And the actual house of Hein is in Jarnac, right on the Charente River. And that's where all of the aging and the blending takes place, and where all the paradis are and things like that, where all the expensive cognac is, essentially.
That's right. Yeah. Now, obviously, we've been talking about whiskey and how, you know, it's a great time to be a whiskey drinker because of all of the new distilleries popping up daily, it would seem, and you know the older distilleries releasing more and more good stuff. What's the situation in cognac? Is there a similar kind of revolution going on?
In a way, yes. I mean, I kind of think, you know, cognac is a very, for lack of a better word, it can be a bit snooty sometimes because we are just talking about wine. And so a lot of the time, cognac is kind of relegated into the leagues of the 3 Michelin star restaurants, the digestifs, all of this kind of thing. And for some people in the market, that's a really good place to be. But I think over the last sort of 10, 15 years, you've seen younger cognac producers sort of really coming through the ranks. You've also seen a focus on smaller houses. You know, we know the big three, and they produce great cognacs. But after a while, you want something a little bit different, something with maybe a slightly more, not human touch, but a slightly more kind of a smaller production method, for example. So there's lots of really fun cognacs coming out. You know, obviously Hein being one of them. We've looked after Hein since 2016 or 2017 at Specialty, and it's been fantastic and really opened my eyes up to the world of cognac. You know, you can see independently bottled cognacs now, so you're not just buying from 3 different brands. You've got single cask releases, you've got higher ABV releases coming out. So if you want to try a really fascinating spirit that still hasn't, you know, broken the world of price yet, you can still find some really, really good bargains in cognac. And I think the more people go into cocktails and the more people understand like the history of the Sazerac or the Brandy Cruster or old punches and things like that, the more you see these cognacs cropping up, and the more you kind of understand them as a product of where they came in history. You know, so looking at the old, you know, British punches versus the American cocktails versus all of the kind of the brandies that would come into the UK and things like that. It's just a really fascinating time to be involved in the whole category right now.
Yes, indeed. Now, just taking off your cognac hat and whiskey hat off for the moment. Are there any other spirits? Well, I know the answer. There's lots of other spirits that excite you, but is there one in particular at the minute which is you know, ticking the boxes and really catching your imagination?
I mean, in the Nika video, we mentioned Christian Durand Calvados. So if anyone's not watched the Nika video yet, apologies, you will hear that. I think in general, France as a country is producing some absolutely incredible spirits. So Calvados from Normandy, you've also got Armagnac in the south, Cognac, you know, in that kind of southwestern region too. But also, if you go over towards Alsace and towards that kind of German border, you've got some of the most incredible eau de vie that are being made, most of the time by winemakers too. So, and the guys at places like Miklo are making, you know, raspberry or apple or Poire William or all of these amazing eau de vie. I think that's just a really fascinating category. Capriolas Distillery down in the Cotswolds are also doing an amazing job with these eau de vie too. And I know it's not an aged spirit as such, but in terms of purity of flavor and quality of distillation and quality of fermentation, I think these kind of brandies and eau de vie should be getting a bit more recognition than they get. But, you know, we can dive into this and go into agave. We can talk about rum. It's just a vast world of spirits. It just happens that I like most spirits. Yeah. And I get very geeky about all of them. And you're very much the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I was talking to someone earlier and they were saying that they quite like dipping into craft beer or mezcal or whatever it might be. But because their sole attention is generally whiskey, they tend to try not to get so geeky with those things and just enjoy them for what they are and get recommendations, you know, like you've given me and you've given the folks at home as well. And I know I've hopefully got a bottle of the Drouhin arriving today, the Calvados, so I'll definitely be giving you my assessment of that. So yeah, so it's a good time to be into spirits, and I would definitely encourage people to seek out different things, try different things. I think my New Year's resolution will be to taste, outside of my comfort zone and listen to more people's recommendations, because, we trust you.
Though, isn't it? Because there's so much going on, even within whiskey. Every time we do a festival, there's 3-4 new distilleries where you're trying, Filey Bay, Yorkshire Whiskey Company. They've just come out and they're producing some amazing stuff. We weren't talking about that 2 years ago because they didn't have any liquids.
No,
Yeah,
that's
right. So, just branching out from whiskey is almost already really difficult. And then if you go down the other rabbit holes like that, like craft beer or, Premier Cru Burgundy, then you're just in a whole world of confusion. And
yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, Nathan, thanks once again for coming on. Really appreciate you giving us your time again. I'm just going to say to you, thanks. And what would we say? What do you think? Cheers.
Santé works.
Yeah. Or votre santé, something like that. But anyway, have a good one. Thanks very much, Nathan.
Always a pleasure.
And Merry Christmas, and have a great New Year. And no doubt see you, if not in person, in the early New Year. Certainly, hopefully in person at the end of February. But all the best to you and yours.
To you as well, sir. Have a good one.
Cheers. Thank you.